My name is Peter Kelly-Detwiler, and I have the pleasure of moderating the CleanTX webinar today, Texas Cities Climate Action Plans. And with me, I have the pleasure of speaking with Lara Cottingham from the city of Houston, Susan Alvarez, who was not able to dial in so that we can actually see her, but she's calling in to share her insights. We have Zach Baumer from she's from Dallas, Zach Baumer from Austin, Doug Melnick from the city of San Antonio, and then we have Ben Hubbard, who's the CEO of Nexus PMG, and his company helps cities get things done. So once plans start to get enacted or rolled out, Ben's group says, okay, here are some of the challenges you run into. We'll talk about that as part of our conversation today. We do have 5 folks, so it'll be a lively conversation, and we have an hour. So what we'll do is we'll run the conversation for 40 minutes, and then because we have quite a large number of attendees, we'll open it up for questions for the last 20 minutes or so. So one of the things in looking recently at the space, there have already been 12 states that have now committed to 100% renewables. And in looking at your various plans, looks like some or maybe even all of you now have committed to 100% goals by some visible year, 2050 or someplace around there. It strikes me that you all have a really interesting challenge ahead of you. And the first question I wanted to ask, even before we get into the specifics, and I think I'll start with Susan, because I want to make sure to remember you're there since I can't see your face, Susan. In working on developing the plan and then every day moving that forward, how often do you get to interact with the likes of the other folks we have today on the panel with us? How often do you get to share experiences with other cities? What's that look like these days?
Well, like everything else, it's by phone and by webcam these days. Generally, we've been getting together by phone or before COVID in person, I would say on a near quarterly basis. And it's been really helpful to Dallas because we learned from the experience of some of the other cities like Austin and San Antonio that were a little bit ahead of us to start with. And so we knew what not to do. And you know, right now we're all kind of chatting together about, well, what does implementation look like? And so I value the ability to talk to my friends in other cities, and we're generally moving forward together on this.
Well, thank you. You've piqued my curiosity. Can you give us in the audience a good example of what not to do?
Well, the previous sustainability officer in San Antonio, before Doug had the position, when they started out on their climate plan, they had a whole plethora of different committees that they were using to get community input into the plan. And what happened is their staff spent all their time running around to meetings, and it was very challenging. And so what we did as a result of the feedback we got from San Antonio is we did one big happy stakeholder committee, and we made the environmental advocates talk to the business advocates, and we had public health and academia and some of our agencies in the room at the same time. So we made everybody talk together. Instead of having separate committees for business or for environmental advocacy, et cetera.
I could see that.
And that way, at the end, yeah, they couldn't say that we were off in a room with the environmentalists or vice versa, even though I said that anyway, but it just wasn't what happened.
That does sound like a pretty important lesson learned. Lara, you and I have had a chance to chat recently in the past for another event. So I've had a little bit of an ability to get an insight into what you're all working on there. But one thing that struck me is Houston being the energy capital of the world. Can you talk a little bit about the significance of the climate plan within that context?
Absolutely. It is fabulous to be here today, and it is fabulous that you have Houston and Austin and Dallas and San Antonio all talking about climate action plans at the same time, right? Like that is so important to our state. But from a Houston perspective, it is historic, right? That the city of Houston has put out its first climate action plan. And that is because, to your point, we are proudly the energy capital of the world. And so for Mayor Sylvester Turner to proudly stand up and say, not only do we believe in climate change, but we understand that we have a very important and very large role to play to commit the city to carbon neutrality by 2050. That is very meaningful on a local and on an international scale, because the world does look to Houston, even though the mayor and the city does not control any oil and gas company or operations, right? We don't have a super secret R&D team in the basement, but they look to Houston as a sign of where the industry is going. So the fact that we would stand up and make this commitment is huge, but what is even bigger and even more impactful is that you're seeing the companies in Houston also make those commitments. So that is Houston's fairly unique role in this story. If the companies that are based here can reduce their emissions in their operations, we can reduce emissions in cities all over the planet.
Thank you. Now, you and Dallas have a unique challenge, or maybe a disadvantage, that San Antonio and Austin don't have, in that they have their own utilities. So that helps with the electricity side. Doug, I want to lean into a little bit. So you work with, in San Antonio, CPS, and certainly Paula Gold-Williams is a well-known individual in the energy space dealing with the sustainability issues and bringing in the community. What are some of the challenges if you're Dallas or you're Houston, you're kind of a price taker, if you will. You've got to deal with what's on the ground, versus if you're in an Austin or a San Antonio, there's that opportunity and challenge of working with the utility to try and meld those plans. How often do you meet with CPS, and where are you joined? Is it at the hip or more loosely? What does that look like?
Yeah, so we work really closely with CPS on a almost daily basis. They're pivotal to our climate objectives, whether we're talking about their generation or electrification or you name it. I think not all municipal utilities are equal. I think when you compare CPS to Austin Energy, structurally, Austin Energy is a component of the city of Austin. They're a department reporting directly to their mayor and council, whereas in San Antonio, they're an independent. They're responsible for their own daily operations, and the role of mayor and council is to approve rates and appoint trustee members. So it's a little different. I think the objectives are the same. I think where CPS is, CPS is on board with, we need to strive towards meeting these big goals. Carbon neutrality by 2050 is a big goal, but at the same time, they are working to ensure reliability and affordability, and that's a big issue locally. San Antonio, like the other cities on the call, have a lot of folks living below or near the poverty level. And so when you start talking about transitioning to renewable and clean energy and using battery storage, we really want to make sure we're looking at what those cost impacts are and who bears those costs. So, I would say, any city needs to work with their utility, and I do think we are lucky to have a municipal-owned utility, because there is a heightened degree of accountability, and there's a degree of if CPS realizes that they're there to serve the community, and so I think it's we look forward to continuing those conversations and also seeing what our other city partners are doing in terms of their utility work.
Great, thank you. And I know, Zach, Austin Energy's been really well known for its green purchases and energy efficiency and so on for, decades now, and having one of the first green purchases. But who else in Austin, when you're working on the climate plan, who else is sitting around the table with you to help develop that joint vision?
Yeah, in Austin, obviously Austin Energy is a big part of the conversation, and because they're an integrated part of our city organization, they're just with me. Business, having business and large employers at the table are important. Also, all of the other public sector agencies are part of our process. So Cap Metro, our regional council of governments, the MPO, the county, and more trying to work with surrounding cities, surrounding suburban cities, and surrounding counties. But then I think the last one is that there are a lot of local nonprofits, environmental groups focused on any topic that you can imagine that connects back to sustainability and climate change. They're at the table, and we really do a lot of work to make sure that we are including smaller groups and community organizers as part of our process, because they're just essential to what we do here in the city.
Thanks. One more question. You mentioned business. So what is, when business is in those conversations, what are they, I'm going to paint them with a broad brush, but are they looking for business opportunities? Are they trying to make sure that it's not going to cost them a lot? What are they looking for?
Yeah, I think number one, they're just looking to make sure that there aren't increased costs and aren't increased burdens on them. And then I think we, try to flip it around and try to figure out how can we have incentives and how can we balance our incentives with their, get this cat going here.
Yeah, he's great.
The conversation about incentives and about partnership to here's what we want to get done. We want to get more electric vehicles. We want to get more charging stations. How do we partner with business to make sure that happens? So it's, I think the main thing is just having those relationships and having those conversations and doors open, and building trust in those relationships, so we can talk frankly about what really the challenges and the issues are, and then have that conversation about, is this a regulation or a requirement, or is this an incentive, or, how can we partner to make this work for everybody?
Thank you. Well, the cat just jumped over behind Ben's head, saying that Ben's the next person on the list here. Speaking of businesses, so Ben, you and I talked about how you get engaged helping cities take concepts and bring them to fruition, often pointing out where they might run into pitfalls that, as someone who's actually bringing these things to reality, you're very aware of because you've done them in the past. Can you describe a little bit how that dialogue with cities unfolds from your perspective?
Yeah, certainly. So, some of the challenges that essentially arise during the process of kind of taking these plans and implementing them into actionable frameworks is, one is the economic viability, right? These projects and these plans that get put in place still have to be economically viable for all the counterparties involved, whether that's through things like public-private partnerships. The cities, can't unfortunately lose tremendous amounts of money on doing these types of initiatives. The public works groups that are worked with, or even private businesses that come to the table, still need to, have some sort of economic viability to justify these things. So some of the roadblocks and challenges we see when we work with the cities is making sure that the plans, the objectives that are put in place, can be backed by plans that where all parties are benefiting appropriately, knowing the overall goal is to reduce the carbon intensity and footprint. Some of the challenges come with, as you look at more public-private partnerships and more sophisticated money comes into these types of endeavors, particularly infrastructure funds. The sophistication of the finance side of things can often be overwhelming. So what we often like to see is, partnerships between the cities and folks like ourselves and many other companies out there that can provide a nice advisory board style implementation or community implementation to really think about all the various different angles. We talk here about energy, and naturally, and even a large part of the audience listening is probably thinking energy being power generation, right? But energy is everything, and not just not just the production of things like renewable fuels and actual power generation, but how you produce that. So you think of things like if we need to produce energy, how do we extract a lot of the waste that's going to our landfills and convert that into different types of forms of energy? So there's a big picture, and it can quickly become incredibly overwhelming because of all the different moving parts. The other challenge we see is, unfortunately, sometimes when you're creating opportunity, you're displacing somebody or a business somewhere. The landfill businesses, the charging stations mean you're likely, if you go down the electric vehicle route, you're displacing somebody else's business. And so trying to figure out how to incorporate the businesses that can unfortunately somewhat suffer from these types of environments, as positive they are as the overall goals and objectives, trying to figure out how to work with them and make sure that they can remain a part of the story is something that we see can be a challenge, because people's businesses are impacted as you make progress in this sector, and trying to figure out how to incorporate them into the story and make sure everybody's got some sort of benefit out of these initiatives is really a key. So those are some of the key areas that we hone in on.
Otherwise, they can become opponents pretty quickly, I would imagine.
Exactly. Yeah, and objectors can deteriorate goals pretty quickly when you have too many of them.
Yeah, certainly. We've all seen that. I think in all the plans that I saw in the cities, there was a discussion around equity, racial equity, and opportunities for low and moderate income folks. And Susan, your plan discussed that, the focus on equity. What types of challenges, and in fact, I remember reading in your process an explicit effort, which I'm sure all the cities were involved in, to pull in representatives of those communities. But what specific and particular challenges, Susan, are created in terms of making sure that all aspects of the community are brought together, but especially those who otherwise might be left out and are disadvantaged?
So I wouldn't call it a challenge as much as possibly a change in process. So one of the first things we did was we did an outreach and engagement kit based on the Government Association for Racial Equity. And so as we approached our events, we looked at what the likely audience was, what their needs would be. And to be quite honest, our first couple of public meetings were not that successful relative to attendance. And so we revisited, and we ended up, we had what we called the ICE effect, which was that there were some members of our community that didn't feel comfortable going to any government meeting in person. And so we did a couple of things. We offered rides. We offered childcare. We went to existing meetings in the community. I spent a lot of Saturdays down in it's called 4 Oak Cliff, but it's a neighborhood nonprofit. I just kind of hung out there and talked to whoever was there. So it was kind of a change in how we approached outreach, and we were extremely mindful. We tracked where we went. We tracked how many and what kinds of people we were able to speak with. And at the end of the day, we were really proud because we absolutely reached and got input from every single zip code in the city. And there's like 100 some. So that was an achievement that we were really proud of. But it took a great deal of effort on our part. And again, my Saturdays at 4 Oak Cliff, basically it got to the point where people would go ahead and talk to us. The other thing that we did that was kind of, I think, a little bit innovative is that we solicited students from UNT University Hills, which is a South Dallas campus, from the community college, from Paul Quinn College, and we did a meeting in the box and let the students lead the meeting process and solicit input. And that way it was, people could talk to people that they trusted, and we could get the information that we really needed to make an equitable plan.
Thank you. Lara, you mentioned Houston being sort of that energy epicenter, and I spent a summer there, and it was my observation that you couldn't throw a rock down the street without hitting an energy expert. There were just so many of them. I was really impressed coming from Boston, where we have a few, but not like that. So in these partnerships that you alluded to, what does a good one look like? Can you give us an example of, and if you're comfortable naming names, fine. If not, in general terms, what does a good partnership look? Either with a business or some other counterpart that really helps you advance the goals that you're responsible for moving forward for the city?
So I cannot stress enough how important partnerships are, how incredibly grateful I am and the city is and the mayor is to the partnerships that we have put together so far. And I will shamelessly use this opportunity to anyone who is listening that we need more partnerships, right? I can give you some really good examples of what we have so far, and we need 20 more of them. So, and you talked about this a little bit, that Houston is regulatorily different than Austin and San Antonio, because we are deregulated. Add on top of that, we don't have zoning, and we're just a huge city, right? So we have a lot of challenges, and climate change itself is a global challenge. So the idea that the city of Houston on its own could solve every problem is not realistic. However, we want to do as much as we possibly can. So we have to build those partnerships. A good example is Evolve Houston. The city of Houston really likes the idea of vehicle electrification because we are a car city. I'm sure you noticed that as well when you visited from Boston, right? Houston has a ton of cars. We have these incredibly large highways everywhere, and they have been growing at an exponential pace, right? So the Climate Action Plan talks about how we stop being a car city, but in the meantime, electrifying those cars is a way that we can see drastic and pretty speedy improvements to our air quality and to our emissions reduction. The city has committed to electrifying our fleet that we own. That's about 8,000 vehicles, right? So that's not small, but how do you get to the millions of vehicles in the city of Houston? We created a partnership that was founded by Shell, by NRG, by Centerpoint, the University of Houston, and the city of Houston to specifically look at private vehicles, specifically look at freight, look at fleet. And because the city recognizes that our hands are tied by various regulations. We don't have a lot of control. We don't have the ability to incentivize the way that some other places do. And those are the cards we've been dealt, right? So we want to get big, respected Houston names together to talk about how do we get the same end result, but build it a little bit differently, right? Just because it's a square hole, round peg situation doesn't mean it's impossible. And so Evolve is a great example of bringing funding and bringing respected community members to talk about how we really can advance vehicle electrification in Houston. Another example that I would talk about is all of the community partners, and there are many, 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 too many to name, who have helped just get information out about the Climate Action Plan, right? We have been talking about equity, talking about just really sharing information and getting feedback. Very similar to Dallas, when we first started, we said, okay, well, we're going to send out email. And then you realize, our email list is limited and it only goes to the people who we know. And so you end up having a conversation with the same people over and over again. What we found was connecting with the groups that are already in the communities and selfishly and asking them to share with their networks and building up that trust was so incredibly important in getting feedback. And it is going to be so much more important as we move forward, because the Climate Action Plan is great, but it is only as good as its implementation. And the one thing we have guaranteed the community from the get-go is that it will absolutely change. Technology is changing so quickly. Our city is changing so quickly. Look at everything that's happened in the past 5 months, right? And so we have committed to having a continuous open network of feedback and communication, and the city itself can't do that on our own. We need as many organizations to help share what we're doing, share what they're doing, and give us the feedback, be our eyes and ears on the ground and in all of the different various communities in the city of Houston, because that has just been so incredibly important.
Thank you. I do get the Evolve newsletter each week, so I recommend it highly to everybody else. Zach, you had mentioned in our preparations that there are 3 sectors in the plan: natural systems and some other ones, or consumption of food and goods, and then electric vehicles. Can you elaborate a little bit on the different constituent elements of the plan?
Yeah. So we're right in the middle right now of revising our plan. Our first climate action plan actually came out and was approved in 2015. So this is version 2.0, and so we're trying to learn from what we did before, improve on it, and build on it to make a better plan this time around. Because we have such strong commitment from Austin Energy, that portion of the plan is kind of like their generation plan that's approved. The other major sectors that we're focusing on are transportation and land use and electrification of transportation. So those two kind of go hand in hand to work on strategies to get people out of cars and then electrify the cars that are remaining. We have a group that's focused on sustainable buildings, and really what they're looking at is net zero energy and net zero carbon buildings for new buildings by 2030. And then we have 2 brand new sections to the plan. You know, it was sort of brought up that in our first plan we didn't address green infrastructure, trees, nature, like in any way. So we have this brand new section called natural systems, which looks at agriculture, trees, parks, open space, all of those things, and trying to look into protecting the carbon that is already sequestered in all of those systems, and then thinking about ways that you can manage all those systems to increase the amount of carbon sequestration in our natural systems. Because most of these plans are just thinking about pulling emissions down.
Right.
The natural systems is one of the few where you can actually like pull carbon out of the atmosphere. And then the last section, which is a brand new section as well, is called consumption of food and goods. And the idea there is that our solid waste department is called Austin Resource Recovery. They have a zero waste master plan. They have goals for compost and recycling and dealing with waste. But the idea is that when you do greenhouse gas emissions accounting, and you start thinking about scope 3 emissions, which are the emissions that occur upstream from all of the things that we buy and purchase and use every day, from a laptop to a desk to tomato. All of those things have a massive impact outside of our city, and the decisions that large organizations make when they procure large amounts of things that the city makes, when the city spends all of its money, all the way down to individual consumers. There are all sorts of things that we can, better decisions that we can make to save money and reduce the sort of life cycle carbon footprint of our purchasing choices. So those are the 5 areas that we're covering this time.
Thank you. Doug, I was recently speaking with some they were meteorologists on a trading floor. And we were talking about the fact that ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, no longer relies on a 30-year historical temperature curve. They now use the last 10 years because they said the 30 is useless. And you had made a comment before that but one has to think not only about reducing emissions, but also developing strategies for adaptation, because we're already in a climate change world. So, Doug, what sorts of things are you working on with San Antonio around the adaptation side? What should the audience be thinking about and understanding in terms of what you're doing there?
Sure. So our plan covers a lot of ground. It covers mitigation and adaptation. One of the first things that we had done was we worked with a professor from the University of Texas at San Antonio to do some downscaled climate projections for San Antonio. And it was pretty startling. The end of century high emission scenario calls for our summer maximum temperature to go up by 10 degrees. And when you just look at our past week that we had here, I'm just looking at the results right now. We had 107 degrees, 105 degrees just the past couple days. So add 10 degrees to that. That's hot. We're also looking at it getting drier. We're also looking at increased vulnerability and to wildfires. I mean, you name it. So the plan really starts looking at how do we improve the resilience of key infrastructure, whether it's transportation infrastructure, whether it's our electric infrastructure. We really focused on vulnerable populations, like we've been hearing from other folks on the panel. At the end of the day, we know, our communities of color, our seniors, those pre-existing health conditions are going to bear the brunt of these climate impacts, and in fact, they're bearing them now. So, looking at opportunities to provide additional support, whether it's through local food opportunities, whether it's providing incentives and resources to improve the efficiency of people's homes, whether it's increasing the amount of green space, tree canopy in low-income neighborhoods that suffer from extreme urban heat impacts. So I think the key to this, it's such a complex issue, and there's so many moving parts. I think the big thing that we're really focused on right now is working with different city departments and different partner agencies to begin to have them align their work with the climate plan and these adaptation objectives. It's not like there aren't resources being expended locally on projects that could move the needle. It's just making sure that we're taking a step back first before we make those commitments to determine, can we tweak a project, can we alter an investment to make sure that it's taking into consideration increasing the adaptive capacity of our most vulnerable communities.
Do you think the average person on the street in any of your cities, but since you're in the hot seat, I'll ask you, Doug, do they know that your city has a climate plan?
Simple answer. I think if you were to take the average citizen off the street, the answer is no. We're at 1.5 million people and growing. Our engagement process, we were able to quantify. We touched and maybe 13. We thought that was a good job. It's a drop in the bucket, and so I think key to implementation going forward is going to be continuing to ramp up communication and awareness activities. But it's not.
Great, thank you. Ben, I'm going to ask you a hard question, which is, in just a couple minutes, describe a project that you've worked on with a city, and then a couple of the potholes you ran into along the way, and how you resolve those, just so people can sort of wrap their head around what that implementation process looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll use limited names just due to non-disclosure agreements, but
a good idea.
We worked with a city whereby there was kind of two angles that we approached a project from. One was a wastewater treatment plant that they wanted to have their municipal solid sludge treated better and used to create the energy to actually power the wastewater treatment plant rather than go to a landfill. In parallel, we work with that same city to figure out how to divert plastics away from the landfill. So essentially, landfill management is a big thing we're seeing with many cities, is how do we put proper things in the landfill, which unfortunately is still a part of the solution and will be for a while, but how can we actually divert many of these things? And so we partnered with the city and we worked with them through a public-private partnership. So we were able to bring a substantial amount of capital partners to the table. Nexus PMG as an entity works for most of the world's largest infra funds here in North America and globally. So we have good, deep connections in, and we're able to bring those connections in both from an advisory capacity to the cities, which I've already spoken to Lara and others about, is, can I help bring some of those relationships to the advisory table, because the folks funding these projects are just as important as anybody else. And then the developers, right? Because you still have technology, you still have all sorts of elements related to the folks that really do the ground floor engineering, the construction management, the EPC professionals that actually build these facilities. So we were able to form a public-private partnership with a very reputable engineering, procurement, construction contractor, a very noteworthy infra fund, as well as ourselves in the city, and bring these two projects to life. And one of them is under construction, the other one is operating right now, and they're using various different forms of technology, like taking plastics and producing fuels and selling those fuels back to one of the major oil and gas providers, as they're responsible for buying that certain amount of that fuel in the market through the renewable volume obligations of the renewable fuel standards at the federal level. And then at the wastewater plant, which is under construction right now, we will successfully divert all of that, and it will power about 60% of the wastewater treatment plant in and of itself. Without getting too far into it, but some of the challenges that we faced, which I mentioned earlier, was the economic viability, making sure that the return thresholds, an unlevered return threshold requirement from the infrastructure fund, and even making sure that the EPC felt like they had compensation appropriate that met the targets. Those are always a challenge. So you're always looking at, how can the cities play a role in making sure that they guarantee certain things on the contract chain, and that's one thing that I would really encourage everyone on this webinar and anybody who's listening that is really responsible for various different sustainability programs is, the funds and the developers of these projects are really looking for bankability and consistency from the city. So if they're looking to build a facility that costs $100 million to divert plastics, then the city needs to stand by and providing those plastics for 10 years and guaranteeing that the volumes will be there. Same thing with, folks like Waste Management, working with them to guarantee that these things will be there. Without those guarantees, it's a huge challenge for the infrastructure funds and the developers to feel very confident that they can invest that much capital, knowing that at any point in time, their capital could be at significant risk if there's a major deviation. So that level of certainty and guarantees in the supply chain in any of these types of decarbonization efforts we spoke about is really, really important.
Sounds like it boils down in some senses to a question of trust.
That's right. There's a lot of trust, there's a lot of crossing of T's and dotting of I's when it comes to putting something of this magnitude together. And, we see a lot of these goals and objectives that everybody here has are very aggressive. So the timelines of actually implementing also have to be aggressive. Otherwise, it's very easy for a 2030 plan to become a 2040 plan to become a 2050 plan. So the other thing we see is analysis paralysis can be a very big inhibitor, right? You overanalyze so much so that you don't take action. And the irony of the climate action plan is that it requires action. So having the right advisors around the table to make sure you can make decisive actions with confidence is really important.
Thank you. So that sounds, Susan, if I can turn to you, that sounds like to avoid that paralysis by analysis, taking the first step and then the next step and so on and so forth is important. And in our conversation, you'd emphasize in our preparation that the plan for Dallas had like a 10-year time frame, but there were refreshes, and then you were moving incrementally towards that long term. Can you talk to us about how you think about the time horizons in the planning process and the flexibility that gives you or doesn't? Just how do you think about the planning process itself?
So we kind of have two different precepts here, and one is any plan that goes more than 10 years is generally worthless because things change so much. Somebody mentioned, just look at the last 5 months. And the other corollary to that is plans are meant to be changed. One of the directions that our city council gave us is that they wanted a measurable plan with targets and performance measures. And while our end goal is definitely net zero by 2050, we were looking at things like reductions in the cost for energy storage, improvements in solar technology just over the last 2 or 3 years. And so in essence, we're a little bit hedging our bets on improvements in technology over the next 30 years. And so our plan is to update our greenhouse gas inventory every 2 to 3 years. And we will be revisiting the plan every year, but on those 2 to 3 years when we've got new updates to our greenhouse gas inventory, we can see where we are. We can ratchet up our actions as need be, and I suspect they will be. And we can take advantage of improvements in the technology in our world, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Certainly with things like battery costs falling by 50% in 2 years, and really to all intents and purposes, the solar and wind industry is not even existing a decade or a decade and a half ago. I think we have to, yeah, there's got to be some faith play. Yes, you have to get started, but also the knowledge things are going to rapidly evolve. Well, we have already
so that's
cruised
kind
through
of our mindset.
You think? Well, that makes a lot of sense. I'm sure all the other cities are thinking about things somewhat similarly. Well, we've already cruised through our 2,400 seconds here that I was allotted with questions. Now we're going to open it up to the audience, and I want to see if I can see the Q&A. I'm clicking on the button. Oh, gosh, tons of them. Okay, so let me see here. The first one. I'm in the private sector working in clean tech. What is a path into city planning you would recommend for young professionals? Anybody want to take that one?
I'm happy to talk about this.
Yeah, please.
So this is something that the Houston Climate Action Plan really talks about, because we recognize, like I said, Houston is this energy capital of the world, but that's been very traditional energy, right? It's been very traditional oil and gas. Houston is finally starting to get that the concept of an energy transition is not an if, but a when. And so we are really looking at diversifying what we mean by energy when we say energy capital of the world. And so clean tech, green tech, decarbonization, call it whatever you like, has a huge role to play. So we want to build up the entire pipeline from supporting schools, supporting our universities. We have Rice that has a carbon hub. We have University of Houston that has a school of carbon management, but also looking at our startup section. And so we are very happy to have announced just a few weeks after the Climate Action Plan came out that Greentown Labs, the nation's largest climate tech incubator, is opening their second office in Houston. We are thrilled about that. We also have the ION that has a smart cities and resilience incubator and program, and the city works with both of these very closely to help, if not pilot and partner directly with the city, to try and network and matchmake with the different companies throughout our region, so we can make sure that we are developing new types of emissions reduction energy businesses and jobs. We have a goal of creating 50 Energy 2.0 jobs in the climate companies, through the Climate Action Plan. And the Greater Houston Partnership, which is Houston's Chamber of Commerce, is also very interested in this. They actually stole someone from Austin who is doing a fabulous job. Austin does this really well. And so we want to build that up, because that is so incredibly important to Houston's future, to building this low carbon energy economy. And so I highly recommend you come to Houston, because we have lots of options here. We need more people like you.
Thank you. Here's someone who followed up the question I should have asked when I was talking with Doug, which is, okay, what can cities do to increase awareness about their climate action plans? Who wants to grab that one?
I'll take a stab at what we're doing, and I think it's in general a bigger question around just engagement with communities in general is a challenge. I think climate is even more challenging, just because it's been so politicized, and it really is it's a scary topic. And so I think what we've done during our climate planning process and all of our sustainability work, it's really about translating it into what's important to community members. It's yes, we are talking about climate change, but it's about people's health, jobs. It's about mobility choices. It's about quality of life. It's all these great things. So I think the messaging is really important. And I think the second thing is, and I think Lara might have mentioned it, it's the messenger. I think it's really making sure that we're partnering with whether it's business leaders, neighborhood leaders, faith leaders, who can help translate the message and push it out to their audiences. And then again, as I think I also mentioned, San Antonio is a multi-billion-dollar municipal organization, a lot of resources. How do we make sure that climate is something that's organizationally integrated? And so if our transportation department is talking about transportation projects, they're versed on climate and they can speak to it. So, but I think I'll end in saying there's no silver bullet to it. It requires a lot of work. We tend to rely a lot on social media, technology, but at the end of the day, it's about face-to-face conversations, and it's really about getting into the neighborhoods and talking to people.
It's kind of what we heard from Susan before, isn't it? Thank you. Someone asks, Dallas and Houston in particular, since you don't have your own municipal utilities, the question is, do either of those cities engage the electric provider companies in any informal or roundtable discussions towards expanding renewables or offering other sustainable solutions? So that would be either for Susan or Lara.
I can start on that one, and the answer is yes. They were on our stakeholder committee. Additionally, our energy contract for the next 10 years has a provision to allow the city to develop on or off-site renewable energy on our own. So we're exploring how we can take advantage of that piece of our contract. The other thing that we're doing is again, working in the community relative to what homeowners can do and what businesses can do. We have two recent grant successes that I'm really excited about, and they're on totally different ends of the spectrum. One is the Carbon Disclosure Project. Just did a call for a City Business Climate Alliance consort. City of Dallas is one of 8 cities selected internationally to participate in that program, and it's a 3-year program to help us work with our local businesses towards compliance with the CCAP, which is our climate plan. The other is we were just accepted for a national community solar partnership, and that's to help implement renewables on some of our multifamily residences. 58% of our residents live in multifamily, and about 50% of them are in what is considered to be energy poverty. And so if we're able to deploy renewable energy for some of those multifamily facilities, we've made a huge dent in our equity situation.
Thank you. Lara, anything to add?
So we're doing many of the same type of projects that Susan talked about. One that is unique to Houston in terms of solar, in terms of community solar, right? We have a lot of those regulatory challenges. And so we are looking at city-owned property and trying to figure out how we can use that to make solar, make renewables more accessible to all members of the community. And so we just happen to have a almost 300-acre landfill in a community called Sunnyside here in Houston. It is surprisingly not too far away from my office. It is in the middle of Houston, and we hope to turn it into the largest landfill solar project in the country. And a portion of that is going to be community solar. So it's not rooftop solar, but it will be available to community members to invest in and to be able to bring this idea of low carbon, of energy transition into Sunnyside, Texas. I think that is such a fitting way to really highlight the potential. And then if that works, that can be replicated in other cities, but also what other properties does the city have that we might be able to convert to bring that to other parts of our community.
Great, thank you. Someone asked about or mentioned Austin has a new price on carbon. How does that work? How does it address equity issues, especially if people are in lower income brackets? And then, so Zach, that would be for you. And then I'm curious if any other cities are also either have or contemplating carbon pricing. So Zach, can I put you on the hot seat for that one?
Well, I don't think that we have an actual like carbon price. I think what they're probably referencing is Austin Energy when they revised their climate and generation plan this time around. And this newest plan was just adopted by our city council in April. Mm-hmm. In that plan, they're including like an internal carbon shadow price that they're applying to their generation and so what it effectively does is if you're generating electricity in the ERCOT market, you have a price that you will run a power plant and sell the power in. And so it's effectively raising the price on that more carbon intensive generation, so it dispatches less.
Okay.
So it's not a formal thing. It's not a carbon price that you or I would see. It's just an internal mechanism that helps them value carbon more and put more emphasis on lower carbon generating resources and more properly value the higher carbon resources. But it's expected to yield like over 1 million tons in emission reductions as it gets applied to this one coal-fired power plant. So it looks like it is going to be a very effective thing. And with Austin Energy, when it comes to pricing, all of the goals, carbon goals in Austin and the city of Austin, all are tied to council directives that Austin Energy has to stay in the lower 50% of power prices in the state of Texas, and that rates can't raise by more than 2% per year. So any goal that you see Austin meeting, we're meeting those goals while fulfilling those financial constraints. So it's not a either or, it's and.
Great, thank you. Any other cities have a carbon pricing or accent, if you will, for planning purposes mechanism?
This
Okay.
is Sue in Dallas. We don't have our own, but we have a council resolution supporting a national carbon fee and dividend.
Thank you.
And Lara,
go ahead.
I was going to add on to this, and I think we've actually all talked about this citywide. This really highlights the importance of state and federal legislation on the success of each of our climate action plans, right? So cities are the front lines here, and we have committed to doing our part, but in a lot of ways it depends on the state and federal regulations in place. So we all work together to try and advocate for policies that will help reduce emissions. But I really stress the importance of anyone who really cares about this issue, like they need to vote, and they need to vote in a way that will help advance the policies that they're looking for.
Thanks. When we were talking before and Susan's comments about going out there and being visible to people, and then some of the other comments folks have made, it struck me that there's got to be this sort of handbook out there, except you're all working on this in a process of constant evolution. Somebody asks, what recommendations do you have for smaller cities, say roughly 50,000 to 100,000 or maybe even 250,000 inhabitants, in approaching the creation of a meaningful sustainability plan? If Lara, for example, I reincarnated you tomorrow and said, you're in this city, go. where would you look? And what recommendations would you give for yourself in that role in a smaller city?
This is Doug. I'll take a shot. I think there's networks out there. I think first place I would look is if I'm a small community in Texas, I would reach out to the larger cities. I think we want to. We definitely realize that this isn't simply about our own municipal boundaries, and I think as Zach had mentioned, it's reaching out to the neighboring jurisdictions and beginning to have conversations with them. Our plan does call for creating a regional climate coalition. I think COVID-19 sort of put that on hold, but it's about working with these other communities, empowering them and providing them guidance. I think there's some other national organizations. Actually, there's more and more national organizations that really specialize in focusing on local events, whether it's cities or counties, such as the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. So I think there's lots of resources and tools out there. I think it's first starting to reach out with those folks who can help you move it in the right direction.
Great, thank you. Someone asked, so one of the questions is for your local colleges, and somewhat similar to Lara's, the question that she addressed before, but if you're a local student, how best to get involved and understand what the cities are doing? You mentioned also, Doug, you did some work with your local university. Do all of you have formal programs? For example, Zach, in Austin, is there anything with UT or other institutions of higher learning, or?
Yeah, it's not a formal program, but it's, we, of course, I work directly with the sustainability director for the University of Texas. And then, we have relationships with professors at Houston-Tillotson University, St. Edwards, Texas State, University of Texas. And, it's just a never-ending, I'm speaking at their classes. The professors are participating in our processes. When we try to find interns or, we're looking for staff, we reach out and make those connections. So, if you're a young person, reach out to your sustainability office or reach out. Most universities appoint sustainability person as well. So reach out to them, and, these networks of people are all, we know each other.
Okay, so there's already a pretty good network there for people to talk to. Let's see. Someone else commented, here's one, just saying a reminder, and I was going to plug this anyway. So someone commented, just a reminder, if attendees would like to learn more about Austin Energy's generation plan and carbon pricing mechanism, attend CleanTX's GridNext conference next month to hear details. And so actually, before I forget that, let me just mention that event is coming up next month. And you'll be able to, there's going to be a virtual or interactive video tour of VoltaBox to look at e-mobility, a discussion on the current ERCOT situation, Austin Energy's REACH plan, and then a discussion around grid scale storage, and finally, Electrified Texas, the future of transport. I wanted to make sure I got that plug in before the session was over, and hopefully some of you will be able to attend. GridNext is always a great event, and we have fun every year. Let's see. There was a question. What are post-COVID concerns about what the world looks like in terms of fears of surges in emissions? Are there any things you have to plan for specifically coming out of COVID that you have to focus on from a sustainability perspective that wouldn't exist otherwise if COVID-19 hadn't plagued our landscape?
This is Doug. I think the big thing where we are in San Antonio, and I wonder if it's the same with the other cities. COVID definitely took a lot of the wind out of our sails. Our plan passed last October, and we were moving forward with implementation. And COVID-19, the recession, really took council and the community's focus elsewhere. We've been trying to do. We've hard on internal work, so it's about how to the connection between climate action, COVID-19, and the economic recovery. So I think a lot of it has been about messaging to show that climate action isn't this some arbitrary thing, but it supports everything that we're facing right now.
Hey, Peter, I can
Great,
touch
thank
on
you.
that a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah,
I can
please.
touch on that a little bit too, just from a different perspective. It's kind of interesting is we've actually seen a significant acceleration in the sustainability infrastructure investment groups, which has been quite tremendous. I think the resiliency of this sector and the desire to see this sector progress has been quite outstanding, even during COVID. And someone alluded to it pre this while we were doing the testing for this call, which is there's a lot of efficiency right now in everybody's behind their screen. Everybody's always on a Zoom call or a Teams call or something these days now, right? Back to back to back. And I've noticed it with our clients, a lot of people not traveling, no one's in hotels, where it used to be, hey, can I chat with you next week? Oh, how about at 3:00? I'm available. It never used to be that way. And so we're actually seeing a tremendous amount of projects move forward. In fact, to give you perspective, just in the last 12 weeks, generally since COVID started, we have worked on over, I think it was around $3.5 billion worth of sustainable infrastructure transactions across 35 different infrastructure funds. So for those listening that are kind of really concerned about the lack of progress that could happen in the climate change movement, interestingly enough, from our advisory lens, if you will, we've actually seen a tremendous step forward in people looking to deploy capital into these sectors and continue to move this whole segment forward, which is really encouraging.
Well, Ben, on that encouraging note, I realize we've run out of time, but that's a perfect last word. I could not be more grateful to all of you for having shared your insights. And I want to come back a year from now and go, okay, what has been accomplished in the last year? Because I'm sure it's going to be really remarkable. And it's just been a real pleasure. And thank you all for having shared your insights today. Take care.
Thanks, Peter.